I'm so excited to be here tonight. So this is the second event that I get to MC, and it is part of a series which is a first for the Canadian Muslim community, and it's organized, of course, by the National Council of Canadian Muslims, or NCCM, and they're a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to protect Canadian human rights and civil liberties. And they challenge discrimination and Islamophobia, build mutual understanding, and advocate for the public concerns of Canadian Muslims. I just want to make sure everyone can hear okay in the back. The levels are good? Okay, perfect. I know I'm a little vertically challenged, so it may be difficult to see me, so as long as you can hear me. Now, the NCCM is organizing this series of Canadian Muslim town halls in the lead up to the elections. They're not doing it alone. They're doing it with a number of incredible community partners, and I want to recognize them all. They include, of course, the Canadian Muslim Vote. You can give them a round of applause. They're doing excellent work. The Canadian Council of Muslim Women, the Black Muslim Initiative, the University of Toronto Muslim Students Association, and the Institute for Islamic Studies at U of T. Give them all a big round of applause for coming together and putting on this incredible series. So before we get started, of course, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And I want to give you a little preview of kind of how tonight's event will go. If you attended our first town hall with Jagmeet Singh, it's going to be basically the same format. We'll be starting off with a conversation between NCCM's Executive Director, Mustafa Farouk, and the leader of the Green Party of Canada, Elizabeth May. That'll be followed by questions from those community partners who I just mentioned, and then we'll open it to a town hall and questions from the audience that we will pretty much mostly take over social media. So we're asking folks to post their questions on Facebook or Twitter using the hashtag NCCM Townhall. You can post those at any time. If you've already got a burning question, you can go ahead and post it. If something strikes you during the conversation, you can post it then. We will be choosing questions from there and asking them during the town hall portion. Now, if you're not on social media, you're not tech savvy, you're not connected online, not to worry, we won't leave you out. There will be volunteers who have cue cards who will be handing them out. Are those volunteers who are going to be doing that handy? So at the back, she's raising her hand. So if you already know you've got a question or you'd like to get a cue card because you'd like to think about it and be able to write it, if you want to go ahead and raise your hand now, then they can pass them out right now so that you can get started. Otherwise, we'll give you another opportunity to raise your hand a little bit later on and get one, or you can always walk to the back and ask for one. As I mentioned earlier, there is a prayer area just down the hall on the left. If anyone does want to make evening prayers, at any time you can head down and do that. So that's it for all of the housekeeping, and I want to get right down to it because we are behind on time. So let's dive right into what we all came here to do. I'm going to welcome to the stage Mustafa Farouk, the Executive Director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. And I'm going to also ask for you to welcome the leader of the Green Party of Canada, Elizabeth May.
This is now working.
Hey, good evening. Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace to everyone here. It's quite the night tonight, and we're so happy to have everyone here. As you can hear outside, there's the lacrosse team also, super happy about, what we're doing here tonight. And it's so nice to be here at Hart House. It almost makes me feel bad for having gone to York University for law school. But they have put up enough wood on the ceiling to indicate that they stripped the Amazon bear. So we don't have to give the U of T too much credit. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you all for coming out here tonight. We have so much here to talk about. And of course, thank you, Ms. May, for joining us. And this is, of course, we're so happy to be joined by Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party of Canada.
Thank you.
So before we sort of get started into the night proper, I want to say sort of what I had said on in the town hall preceding this one. because I think it's important to ground ourselves appropriately in this moment. So obviously today we're thinking about October 21, we're thinking about the upcoming federal election, we're thinking about the implications that that day holds for the next 4 years. But it's also critical, and what I've been thinking about is another day, and that day is January 29th, 2017. So on January 29th, 2017, Alexandre Bissonnette walked into the Quebec City Mosque and took 6 members of our family from us. And I'm going to read their names. Ibrahima Berry, Mamadou Tanu Berry, Khalid Al-Qasimi, Abu Bakr Thabti, Abdul Karim Hassan, and Azzuddin Sufyan. Allah yarhamhum. On that day, Islamophobia touched all of us as we experienced the largest attack on a religious institution in Canadian history. And I think all of us can remember where we were when we heard the news that this attack had taken place and what kind of an impact that had for all of us. And it's important for us to think about that date, that moment of horrendous violence, in the context of where we are today, where in Quebec, not too far away, the CAQ government has passed Bill 21. And what Bill 21 does is that it means that those survivors, had they been alive today, or the survivors and the families, if they were to apply for a public sector job, like being a teacher, like being a police officer, they wouldn't be allowed to do that today. So it's in that context that I wanted to begin our conversation, and it's in the light of that context. And so, if I come on strong today, it's because I feel strongly.
Mm-hmm.
And we at NCCM, we're a nonpartisan organization, but we believe that every leader who takes the big step of putting their hat forward and putting their foot forward to becoming the next Prime Minister of Canada, that they have to answer certain questions about safety,
Mm-hmm.
security, and the future that is at the top of the minds for many folks in our community. And so with that, let's turn it over to you, Ms. May, for an opening 5-minute statement.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. It's a very large honor for me to be invited as one of the federal party leaders to join you today. I'm so encouraged. I know there are a number of partners here, and it's terribly important, regardless of how Canadians are going to vote, that in this most important election of all time, that everybody votes. And I was speaking earlier to some of the volunteers with Canadian Muslim Vote and just saying, all I'm trying to say to everyone in the time between now and October 21st is we have to try to ensure that every single Canadian with the right to vote votes. And all I plead is that people vote for what they want. We have this very perverse voting system, first past the post, which makes people time after time think they can't vote for what they want because they might get something worse. And voting for the lesser of two evils is a terrible system for any democracy. We really have to, and fortunately with 6 parties now being prepared to return members of parliament to the House of Commons, 6 parties, increases the likelihood of a minority parliament. So I'm a very old school parliamentarian. I refuse to ever accept the idea that I'm running for Prime Minister because that's an oxymoron in Westminster democracy, and you didn't say that, Mustafa, good for you. But we are, of course, anyone who's a leader of a federal political party is putting themselves in a position where if enough members of their party win their own seats, they could become Prime Minister. The likelihood in this election is for a minority parliament. And I'm quite certain that at the last moment, because it's usually at the last moment, someone will start saying, oh my gosh, you have to vote for us, generally the rest of the sentences, to stop the Conservatives. And what I want to share with everyone is think about a minority parliament, think about it creatively. Think about what it means to have a lot of parties have to work together to make it work. Look into our history. The most productive parliament we've ever had in terms of building our social safety net was in the 1960s under a minority Liberal government led by Lester B. Pearson. It was that parliament that created unemployment insurance, the Canada Pension Plan, universal health care for Canadians. Not only to mention that, but student loans that did not involve interest, and a number of other things, including our flag. We are long overdue for the next steps in our social safety net. We are long overdue for ensuring that just as every other country around the world that has universal health care, it includes universal pharmacare. That's not negotiable. We need to ensure that every Canadian student emerges from university without student debt. How do we do that? We abolish tuition and we put massive funding supports to our universities and colleges so that the administrations aren't constantly thinking they have to figure out, excuse the vernacular, how to get more bums in seats in first year and charge people through the nose and never hire the newly minted PhDs for tenure-track positions. These are critical issues for our country. We also need to welcome more immigrants. We have a dwindling population of young people and an exploding population of people like me with one foot in the grave. No, I'm telling you, I plan to work for a really long time, but I am 65. I'm at the tail end of the boomers. And we now, very soon, will outnumber the younger people. So to keep our economy healthy, we must welcome immigration. And because of the climate emergency, we have to start preparing for climate refugees, a whole new class of refugees, and Canada needs to make room. In the context of Bill 21, it's an abomination. I think every single, as far as I know, every single federal party, I don't know about People's Party, but all the real parties are opposed to Bill 21. Because I made a point in my press conference in Quebec, I recognize our common roots as all the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition being the tribes of Abraham. We share a whole lot of commonality. I wear my religious symbol. It's part of my rights, as it is your right to wear a hijab, to wear whatever religious symbol, for Sikhs to wear their turbans. You can't take that away. I do know that Quebec has a very interesting, and we can maybe get into this later, the Bouchard-Taylor Commission. Very interesting history. A lot of overlaying of institutional church on oppressing freedom of expression in the Duplessis era, which has given rise to the peculiarity of even progressive intellectuals in Quebec thinking that somehow they're exceptional. But we have to enforce the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So we go through all of this. I want to close by saying the climate emergency overshadows all other issues because it's pressing and it's irreversible. I've been working on the issue of the climate crisis since 1986, when I first learned about it when I was senior policy advisor to the Federal Ministry of Environment. You would have thought I would have made more progress by now, but we've made very little progress. In fact, we've gone backwards. From 1992, when we succeeded in having the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, every single world leader, I was there, my daughter was less than 1 year old, every single world leader was there to commit to eliminating greenhouse gases fast enough to ensure that levels of anthropogenic climate change were not dangerous. We pledged that in 1992 on a stage that went from Fidel Castro to George Bush. Everyone pledged that we would cut our dependence on fossil fuels to avoid the climate emergency that we're now in. And between 1992 and now, we've burned more fossil fuels than we had between the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1992. So with every year that goes by, we're in an increasing situation of danger to where we now, and it's hard luck for Justin Trudeau, who I think he does care about climate, but the strategies he wants to employ are incremental and inconsequential because they fail to meet the requirements of the moment. And the requirements of the moment are to marshal all our resources, all hands on deck, to ensure that we stop using fossil fuels by 2050 and that we cut in Canada our greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2030. This is doable, it's all possible. So Greens are committed to 6 core green values. There are 80 green parties in countries, or not 80 green parties, there's many because there's more than that within Canada, but 80 federal national green parties, 80 countries around the world have Greens. I co-chair the Global Greens Parliamentarians Association, where there are 400 members of parliaments and congresses around the world. And the 6 core green values, of course, include respect for diversity, ecological wisdom, peace, and nonviolence. We're the only political party in the world that is both global and committed to peace and nonviolence, as well as, of course, grassroots democracy, social justice. You can't get anywhere in this world in the 21st century unless social justice and equity run through the middle, the core, the backbone of any policy. So I will close there because I didn't put the timer on, but my inner clock tells me that's about 5 minutes. I'm not sure. But thank you for being here. Shukran. And I'll try Urdu. Shukriya? Not sure.
That's pretty good.
Okay. Merci beaucoup, Megwich.
Thank you so much. So let's get right into it. And I want to lead off with sort of a personal question. So when I was in high school, I feel like I might be dating myself, but when I was in high school, I read your book, How to Save the World in Your Part-Time.
In your spare time.
In your spare time.
Tongue in cheek. But you,
Yes.
that's so exciting.
Yes.
You were the one who read it.
And so now, as the new sort of executive director of NCCM, I'm wondering if you'd be considering writing a sequel, like How to Save the World on a full-time basis.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that
Thank you.
I've been reading your books. So.
Thank you. Well, I wrote that book because as an activist before, I'm still an activist.
To learn how to write like press releases.
Yeah, how to do these things. There's no, it's every, as I said in the beginning of the book, every non-government organization, every little group that decides we're going to save our school, every group that says we have to protect our healthcare system, or we want to protect that particular tree that defines our park, has to start from scratch because there are no guidebooks. So that's why I wrote it. And I'm so pleased I wrote it when I did because I learned how to be an activist basically from my mother. And she died in
Her work on landmines, if I recall.
Yeah, and atmospheric nuclear weapons testing.
Right.
And civil rights, and then against the war in Vietnam. Anyway, as I was raised by a mother who never stopped being on one issue after another, I learned a lot from her. And when I was working on the book, she was still alive. She died in 2003. So I was able to go back and double check things with her. And I'm so glad I did that because oral history and the things you remember for your parents, for those of you who are young people, ask your parents now and write it down because our histories are important and knowing where we came from and the struggles of our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and so on. But my mom's history was really helpful to me. And talking to her about all those bits because she was an extraordinary activist. So I grew up in the US, I'll finish this fast. And when we moved to Canada, we were literally loading the car when it was released that there was something called Nixon's enemies list. It's how it was revealed, I don't know. Someone got hold of it, and I'm very proud to tell you that my mother was on Nixon's enemies list. So we packed up and left the US without regrets and moved to a village of 42 people on the Cabot Trail in Cape Breton Island.
So when people keep talking about immigrants, they're talking about that.
Yes. We got in on a minister's permit from Alan J. McCacken, who was at that point the member of Parliament from Cape Breton, and our real estate agent knew him and knew that we were having a terrible time with Canadian immigration. They thought we were trying to get into Canada because of my father's high blood pressure and we just wanted to take advantage of the healthcare system. Plus ça change, right? Anyway.
So, sort of let's jump into some of the more substantive questions.
Yes.
So let's talk about a number one issue in our community, which is jobs. So a 2015 report from the Canada Dawn Foundation found that unemployment amongst Canadian Muslims was 6 points higher than for the national average. And of course, we all know there's lots of reasons for that. There's economic stratification, race and racialization. And of course, as part of your platform, you've promised a guaranteed basic income.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if you could take 2 minutes to explain what is a basic guaranteed income, and then if you could talk about what do you plan to do to make sure that every Canadian, every Muslim, every Jew, every Christian, everyone from every sort of background in Canada has a job.
If they want one.
If they want.
Okay. And I think people do want meaningful work. I think we have to examine the world of work and make sure that we are not becoming commodified. I hated it when, I'm sensitive to language, when personnel departments started being described as human resources departments. I was thinking about this today, and I was thinking about Facebook and Google, as an example, have moved into our economies and into our lives, and they're basically mining us for data, and they make us think we should be enjoying them because they are toys. Not toys, they're dangerous. So the notion of human resources always bothered me because work should be meaningful. Life should be about more than income. I have a very strong belief that every human being should be able to experience their full humanity. Just as I also believe that every pig should be allowed to experience its best pigginess, and every eagle should be able to, we anthropomorphize a lot, but Green Party members tend to be very attached to the natural world as well and think in terms of nature's rights. So how do we do these things? Guaranteed, we call it a guaranteed livable income within the Green Party because there's some concern, there's support for guaranteed basic income that comes also from the right wing. We want to make very clear that the income levels we set have to be livable. And the notion of it that we are completely committed to, and were before I became leader. So one of the reasons I joined the Green Party was when I found out that the Green Party of Canada supported a guaranteed livable income. We are a country that has it within our reach to eliminate poverty here and to fulfill our fair part of the global goals of the Sustainable Development Goals to eliminate poverty globally. The essence of it is this: every Canadian will get a check. It's not needs-based testing. It's just everyone gets a check that amounts to enough to live on. And any money you make past that, you keep. There's no such thing as the current welfare systems and many other shame-based systems claw back money if you start making money elsewhere. It encourages an underground economy. It tells people that, well, okay, pay me in cash if I clean your house because if they find out I've made some money, it won't be worth the time I've taken to find someone for childcare to take care of my kids while I clean your house. This is a perverse system. Now, the way we would go at it is, at a larger level, we want to reimagine the Canadian Federation without opening the Constitution. So, from 1867, when our Constitution was created, we were a largely rural population with very few people living in cities. As a result, the role of municipalities in this country has been as sort of creatures of children of provinces, wards of provinces, and yet now most Canadians by far live in cities, but cities have limited taxation abilities. They can't, there's no such, the only taxation they can do is property tax. So we want to create a different kind of table for decision making. We launched this proposal in 2015. We like it even more in 2019. But imagine a table that's a circle in 4 quadrants. We drew this idea of the Council of Canadian Governments from something they do in Australia, Council of Australian Governments, where there's the federal, in Australia the state, obviously in Canada, provinces and territories, local governments, and our 4th quadrant that they don't have in Australia but should, is Indigenous governments. So First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So, as in Australia, there are several tables. There's one big national one on which the Prime Minister sits, and so on. And then smaller ones, not smaller physically, but looking at specific issues. one of the first things that such a council of Canadian governments should figure out is working with the provinces and the municipalities and Indigenous peoples is what programs can be removed if no one is poor. You don't need the people to go around and find out if a single mother has moved in with her boyfriend because everybody gets a check. There's no needs testing, there's no bureaucracy. And you don't need necessarily any of the disability payments. Everybody's raised out of poverty. But we do need to figure out, and this is a big question, where do we set it to be livable, given that some places are far more expensive to live in than others? How do we, so that's a project for negotiation, but we should be able to bring this in within, certainly by 2024, maybe 2025, but it will require knowing to make it feasible, to make sure that every Canadian is raised out of poverty with a simple device of, sometimes people call it a negative income tax, because the money received, if you're making a good income, goes right back out again. But there's no shame to it. There's no application for it. There's no supervision of it. This means for students, every student would be out of poverty, and then coupled with our program of abolishing tuition, nobody would emerge from university with debt. You'd be able to focus on your studies. The attack on it is always, well, there'll be free riders. A bunch of kids will get together and rent a house because they're guaranteed livable income will let them get together. Where it's been...
They were looking at me when they said
yeah. Where there's been experiments of how this will work, going back to one in Manitoba in the 1970s called MinCom. People use the opportunity of being out of poverty, often to get a different degree, a different diploma, a different opportunity to advance themselves economically. If we could wrap up all of the poverty industry programs, the shame-based programs that don't work to live, they're not intended to lift people out of poverty. They're intended to deal with poverty. So we would end that. But also in terms of jobs, our problem in this country is not that we have too many workers and not enough jobs. The reality is we have a lot of jobs for which employers cannot find employees. So the statistic you've raised is evidence of something that's been proved in a number of empirical studies, that there is an unacceptable degree of racism. That when, not that there's any racism that is acceptable, but when people, and I'm sure you've seen these studies where in sort of blind testing, you submit a resume from John Smith, and you submit a resume from Mustafa, and I'm not going to use your actual last name, but Mustafa Zabim, and you say, okay, who's going to get a job interview? Who gets the call back? It's the John Smith guy.
It's usually not the Lion King guy.
It's not the... yeah. So, we need to do a lot of work on that. And in the Green Party approach, we would have job banks, a lot of community engagement. Right now...
So you're thinking of endorsing like name-blind hiring in government?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. This is a crazy system where people cannot get a call back when they're qualified. We have right now, and as a member of Parliament, I've been very much educated on this because at least when I talk to industries that come to meet with me, they're almost always saying, we have a skills gap. We have a shortage. So when you talk to the mining industry, they're desperate for mining engineers. When you talk to the airline industry, they are desperate for pilots. When you talk to educators, they are desperate for school teachers. When you talk to, so across the country, there are major skills gaps. Why on earth are we not making sure? Because below the unemployment rate, which of course you're going to hear the Liberals tout how great and low our unemployment rate is, there are significant numbers of people who have given up looking for work. So there is a hidden workforce that is not employed that we desperately need, because in order to make the targets that the Green Party has set in Mission Possible to save us from the climate emergency, there are millions more jobs than we actually have workers, which is one of the reasons that we're a pro-immigration party. But every single person in Canada who wants a job within their field of interest should have that job, because look at the shortage of doctors, the shortage of lab technicians, everywhere I look, I'm told by employers, we need help because we have jobs that need to be filled and we can't find the employees. So if we have to point this out through blind CV approaches, no, not like a blind CV, but blind hiring approaches, until the moment of an interview, when you know somebody's got the skills and they've got the recommendations, there shouldn't be an issue. And if there is one, then you know there's a discrimination case to be raised.
So let's talk about some of the questions you raised about racism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was pointed out to me by a member of our audience that sometimes organizations like ourselves, perhaps we should always be careful of making sure that we're clear about the fact that the vast majority of Canadians are lovely, warm, loving people.
Colonial oppressors for 150 years. We're very sweet. Sorry.
But at the same time, the most recent Stats Canada data shows that there was a 41% increase this year in attacks on religious institutions. Now, that's staggeringly high. If we had a 41% increase in, let's say, burglaries, I think we would be having a national conversation about that. And obviously, folks here in the GTA, I mean, we know about this. I mean, for many mosques here in the GTA, there's security. I went to a mosque last night that had security where people were getting scanned. It was like airport security. And it's tragic that, in other parts of Canada, including in parts of the GTA, at synagogues, there's security.
In most of them now.
And I mean, that's just,
in Jewish schools.
and it's just horrifying.
Little kids.
It's just horrifying to me.
Yeah.
So what my question is for you, in reviewing your platform, obviously there is a significant focus on reconciliation and our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And that is critically important. That is a critically important focus. But what about generalized racism in our society? What would be the top 3 things that you would do if you became Prime Minister to address racism in Canada?
Let me go back to something first, because you started by talking about the Quebec City shootings. Where were we? What happened? I remember, because it was a Sunday, got to Parliament Monday morning. It was horrific. I was finding out about it when I was flying back, as I do every Sunday night, Vancouver, Victoria, Vancouver, Ottawa. And I think I landed the news and was looking at it on my phone and just devastated. The next morning I went to work. The first text on my phone was from the Prime Minister's office. All the leaders of all the parties are invited to join the Prime Minister. We're going to go to Quebec City for a vigil. It was one of the most moving things I've ever participated in, for many reasons. One of them was that we were all leaders of federal political parties sparring in the House, invited to join the Prime Minister on this trip. I'd gone to work that morning assuming I was going to be in Parliament all day. I wasn't warmly dressed. So there we were all on this plane, and Ronna Ambrose looked at what I was wearing. She was then interim leader of the Conservative Party, sort of a different party altogether in some ways than what we see under Andrew Scheer. But anyway, Ronna looked at me and said, "Oh God, Elizabeth, you're not going to survive with those boots. You're going to freeze. I've got these," and she had these foot warmer things. She said, "Put these in your boots and put these in your mittens." And then someone else, and Tom Mulcair didn't have anything proper to wear either. We bundled up and we shared. And then we stood outdoors. It must have been -30. Were you there that night too?
I was.
It was unbearably cold. We're all holding candles, and there were probably 500 Quebec families there, in the dark, with their children bundled up in parkas, and all of us weeping, because members of that mosque community, their imam, and members who'd survived were all on the stage with us. We were on the stage the whole time, by the way, so we also couldn't do movement things. We're standing there and praying and freezing, and I looked out on this sea of faces. Quebecers were struck through their heart to think that someone would do such a thing. And at one point I looked up on a snowy hill just above where we were all gathered, and there was a row of, I don't know how old they were, kids who were obviously just coming home from hockey practice. And they just stood there quietly holding their hockey sticks, and they were part of this vigil. So it was horrific. and none of us could bear it. It was unspeakable, but also there was so much solidarity in the non-Islamic community of Quebec to say, this is so deeply wrong. We are so very, very wounded by the idea that a Quebecer could do this. Now, just to say that the rise in hate crimes, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny, they're all on the rise. How did this happen? The government of the United States, the notion of so-called populism, has opened a dark place that had been never completely hidden. The guarded metal doors chained and bolted against racism and prejudice in Canada and elsewhere have been pried open. Social media plays a big role in this. So one of the first things I would do is make sure we control social media. The accounts must not be anonymous. Their names must be published. These outfits...
So you'd be calling for like a regulator of social media companies?
Yes. But also Facebook, Twitter, all of them. They allow people to... They claim they're not publishers. They are clearly publishers. If they had to abide by the rules of publishers, they'd know they could be sued. That's why when you write a letter to the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail, they want to know your name, your address, your daytime work number to verify you really sent that. On the social media pages, where they are, as I mentioned earlier, mining our data and making money off of invasions of our privacy, for which we have never agreed, mind you, they take that. They take our data, but they also allow one person or one corporate entity, in the case of fossil fuel climate change denying propaganda, I'm certain, because they proved it in the UK, they did a lot of digging, I'm certain that a lot of the accounts that are out there that say that there's no connection between burning fossil fuels and climate change are run by one consultant group that works for big oil and has zillions of accounts that look like different people. In any case, we need to know who they are. They have to be held accountable for their publication, just as a letter to the editor is.
Sure, so that's one would be two.
Yeah, the other thing, before I finish with social media, I have very sweet constituents who are like little old ladies who write me all the time. I write back. I'm very connected to my constituents. So one is someone from, I won't identify this person too much, but let's just say otherwise a good-hearted person, had been involved in refugee work. Suddenly this person, and thanks to this person writing me all the time, I get links that I would never otherwise see to fake news that Justin Trudeau is trying to bring Sharia law to Canada. People believe this. People believe that ICRA's motion 103, to have a study on Islamophobia, is a mechanism to bring Sharia law to Canada. They are prepared to believe all sorts of outrageous lies because it's presented in a way that looks real. So we have to regulate that sector, and we have to shut down pages that promote hate speech and divide Canadians by giving them the notion that there's something to be afraid of. So anyway, the whole social media piece requires a complete cleansing. Then we have to, of course, ensure that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is observed, the making sure that we do more in celebrating our cross-cultural, multicultural, diverse identity. We have to celebrate it more, and we have to call out racists. There's too many politicians in this country who play footsie with white supremacists who don't want to call it out. But it's vile. So, is that three? There's probably many, many other things I'd like to do with and it's what Martin Luther King said, you can never eliminate, I mean, I'm not going to remember Martin Luther King's quote exactly correctly, but You can't legislate or regulate to ensure that human beings behave properly and that their hearts are pure. But you can regulate and enforce the laws to make sure that they can commit no wrongs against their fellow men. That's what you can do. And we absolutely must be more vigilant about the promotion of hate speech. I mean, we've got neo-Nazi groups forming within Canada.
Right, and we're going to talk about that.
Oh, okay.
So one of the quick things I just wanted to quickly talk about before we go in further is, you obviously were the Green Party was one of the first, I believe the first party to back our motion, NCCM's motion, to have January 29th recognized as a National Day of Action.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that for just 1 minute? What made you sort of get behind that?
It's a no-brainer. I mean, this was, as you said, this was the single worst attack on people at prayer, regardless of what religion we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And as a sign of solidarity with our Muslim brothers and sisters, as a sign that this country doesn't forget, we have days of this and days of that. We've got them up the yin-yang every day in Parliament. I seem to vote on National Day for, we had a 5-hour debate on the National Day for Spanish-Canadian cultural celebration. We have days of action and days of pets and days of this. This one matters, right? As does the marking of Indigenous, whether we mark both Orange Shirt Day in late September and Indigenous Peoples Day on June 21st, we mark both. We have a lot to make up for, and anything that sensitizes the general population, that increases awareness and diminishes the chances of amnesia. We're a country, or maybe it's the whole society, or maybe it's the world these days, that has real forgetfulness issues. And it's important to remember. It's important to remember the Shoah, to never forget the Holocaust, to know what it was. It's important to remember individual acts of violence, not to keep mentioning the perpetrators, but to remember the victims.
So I have 2 questions.
Okay.
My first question relates to sort of a discussion about white supremacy, and talking about the fact that, while obviously, many Quebecers got together in the aftermath of the January 29th attacks, attacks against the Quebec City Mosque continue. It feels like it was just a few months ago when a person went to the Quebec City Mosque, punched a person in the face, and yelled a whole bunch of, xenophobic statements. One of the leaders of the mosque had his car arson attacked, right? And this is after the Quebec City Mosque attacks. This is the thing that we're not comfortable talking about. But the fact of the matter is that our counterterrorism experts tell us that violent white supremacist groups are growing in number in this country. And let's take, for example, an organization called the 3%ers. So the 3%ers are a violent white supremacist group. They have a presence across Canada. Their Alberta group alone has 3,000 members on their Facebook group. They practice with live ammunition. They practice with semi-automatic weapons. They build bombs. They show up at anti-racism rallies with electricity staffs, which are basically like stun guns or cattle prods. And they preach an apocalyptic notion that there will someday be a showdown between their group and the Canadian Muslim community. And that's what they're practicing for. This is the reality. It's an equal reality that if it was a person like me, and a bunch of other Canadian Muslims training in the mountains of Alberta with a bunch of weapons, building bombs, going down to city halls with, electricity staffs, we'd be having a very different conversation. We would not be sweeping this under the rug.
No.
Ms. Smith, if you become Prime Minister, what will you do to eradicate violent white supremacist groups in this country?
There's 2 layers to the question. One is, where is this coming from? There's nothing more dangerous than a bunch of young white men with not enough to do. I've got to say,
Well,
no, you look at the Second World War. Look what happened in the US, look what happened in Germany.
It's not out of boredom that people are doing this.
No. Well, I would say meaningful work and a sense of inclusion really matters. There are some politicians who want to practice the blaming of the other for the problems that young men, the youth of Canada right now have a much harder time economically. They're in a gig economy, they're being burdened with debt, they're susceptible to this kind of message that you can blame the other. It was one of my friends, I was at a Global Greens Congress in Germany it was in Brussels a few years ago, where one of the German Greens laid out something that I found shocking, which is what I just said, and it got my mouth and it may have shocked people, but the analysis was this, that in the Depression era, in the 1930s, the United States responded with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. Get everyone back to work, get people back to work, strengthen trade unions, do everything you can to ensure that there is meaningful work for everyone, even if government funds the creation of the jobs. In Germany, there wasn't. And there were a lot of young men who were susceptible to a message from a fascist that you can blame someone else. I'm not saying that the US is setting itself up for those same conditions, but it's dangerous. So young men who want to militarize and who want to create the notion that such a thing as white supremacy can be spoken out loud, there are some root causes that you also need to identify and put people to work. Make sure everyone is working and feels included and engaged. But also, you need to make sure that CSIS stops tracking environmental groups and pursuing indigenous groups and recognizes that these guys are the dangerous ones. And we have to focus on white supremacists as the most dangerous terrorist group within Canada. Or the US, or anywhere else. I can't believe we've got people who want to put swastikas on buildings.
So we've talked about sort of violent white supremacist groups, but what happens when discrimination becomes part of policy? And of course, I refer right now to Bill 21.
Right.
So let's talk about what Bill 21 is for anyone who doesn't know. So Bill 21 is a piece of legislation that was passed by the CAQ government, an act respecting the laïcité of the state. And what Bill 21 does, and I make no bones about this, Bill 21 legislates second-class citizenship for Canadians. That is its function. It says that Muslims, Jews, Sikhs, others who wear religious symbols, they cannot be teachers, they cannot become prosecutors, they cannot become police officers. And what this does, is legislate a form where, my mother, who's trained as a Montessori teacher, her rights are simply not equal to that of another person. Mm-hmm. And to think that we have this system in Canada in 2019 is despicable. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that long ago that there was the banning of the potluck, because that was deemed to somehow, erode our values. It wasn't that long ago that we had the Chinese head tax, because that was somehow seen to erode our values. So right now, NCCM is going in front of the Quebec Court of Appeal to stand against Bill 21 with our partners, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And thus, I want to talk to you about Bill 21. Now, Ms. May, you made your position on Bill 21 clear. But unfortunately, the position of the Green Party of Canada is actually not as clear as it should be. And I'm going to read you a quote from your deputy leader. So your deputy leader said that the party is suggesting to its candidates in Quebec that it is better to say nothing on the issue of Bill 21 if they don't have a clear position on the law. And I quote, "We are kindly suggesting to our candidates that if they are uncomfortable talking about it, or don't really have an opinion, to say, I don't really want to comment on that question." You also went on the record to state that you won't stop your candidates, even on topics such as banning religious symbols in parts of Quebec civil service. You said, and I quote, "We don't ask our employees to represent the leaders' views back to their own writings." I'm sorry, Ms. May, but I find that position unacceptable. And the reason I find it unacceptable is that, we're not talking about, the individual person to represent their own conscience. Because there is nothing conscionable about second-class citizenship, period. This is not a question of conscience. This is a question of basic human dignity. Ms. May, you and I are both lawyers, and we both took an oath to uphold the charter, to uphold its values. And when we say, that people, in our party, or people who work with us, could somehow stand against those core values, could stand against the fact that another colleague sitting beside us, a Jewish man wearing a kippah, couldn't become a prosecutor. The idea that, someone else could become a prosecutor, you and I could become prosecutors, but our Jewish, colleague, our Jewish lawyer colleague in 2019 couldn't become a prosecutor, that's unacceptable. So Ms. Mann, and it's not just a semantic discussion, I want to be really clear about this, because you have a candidate, Pierre Nantel, who, previously, when he was an NDP MP, went on the record to say that Mr. Jagmeet Singh's turban was sort of not acceptable to Canadian.
He didn't say that.
I can read the quote if you like.
You're misconstruing his quote. He was in the period in which they were having a leadership race.
Felt that
he expressed a concern of how Quebecers would react. He did not say.
He expressed, and I quote from the Globe and Mail, he wasn't sure whether there was compatibility, that's the quote, with Quebec values.
That is not a quote, and what I will tell you is he stated he was a candidate for the NDP. They had no problem with him whatsoever till they found out he was talking to the Greens, and then he was thrown out of the party.
I'm
going to defend Pierre Nantel. He is not a racist.
And I'm going to give you a
He's
chance
very
to
strong.
I'll give her a chance to respond. I'll give her a chance to respond, but if you just let me finish.
Okay.
If you just let me finish. I'll give you a chance to fully respond. Don't worry. When you have someone like Pierre Nantel, and I'm not here shilling for Jagmeet Singh. When we were talking to Jagmeet Singh on Wednesday, we asked him a bunch of tough questions. I'm going to ask you the same.
I know. No, I don't like tough questions. I like to give the answers.
And I'll make sure you get a chance to give the answer. When you have, if somebody like in Andrew Scheer's party or Justin Trudeau's party went on the record to say that if for example they had been wearing religious symbols and they felt that wasn't quote unquote compatible with Quebec values, we wouldn't agree. So Ms. May, I'm asking you to state very clearly, will you tell your candidates that they have no business in policing what Canadians or Quebecers wear?
So first of all, let me just say very clearly that the party structure is entirely different in the Green Party than in other federal parties. It is not just a question of one issue at a time where the leader can insist on something or not. I have no powers to insist that our members of parliament vote with me, nor do I have any powers to insist on what they say. The only thing we can insist upon is that we share the same core values. Respect for diversity is a core value of the party. But the quote you read out from Danielle Green, deputy leader, wasn't to say we didn't want people to say anything. We were just saying if you don't have an opinion, you're allowed to say, I don't have an opinion. In other words, we want our candidates to be honest. That's it. We want our candidates to share, but they can't. We will not allow a racist in our party, period. We have expelled people for anti-Semitism, period. We would expel anyone for Islamophobia, period. But the party structure is grassroots. And as leader, I am not empowered to tell Tim Grant over there, who's our candidate in University Rosedale, right? I can't tell him what to do or say because we actually believe in electing individuals who stand on their own 2 feet and express their own opinion honestly and then work for their constituents. Now, in the case of Bill 21, the party policy is exactly what I said my personal view is. We oppose it. It's unacceptable. We stand for human rights. In the context of an election campaign, there are people within the Quebec society, and I've got friends who are radical feminists who somehow think Bill 21 is all right. I don't understand it. Quebec society has an intellectual progressive wing that somehow thinks, and I think this is the problem, and I'm going to just dive into it a bit more. The Taylor-Bouchard Commission on Reasonable Accommodation was absolutely right, I think, to say that in our buildings, in our public institutions, We should remove religious symbols so that everyone feels welcome and no one feels as though when you walk in the Assemblée Nationale, there's a giant crucifix, so others aren't welcome.
I'll let you finish, but I mean, Charles Taylor opposed Bill 21, for the record.
I know, of course. But the point is, there's been a different kind of conversation there that comes from different roots. And the feminist community in Quebec is completely split. I want to be able to fix and find resolution and stop the bill from ever being implemented in a way that means that a school teacher wearing a hijab loses her job. I thought it was brilliant to see the Minister of Education in Quebec standing with Malala Yousafzai and praising her courage and heroism without feeling the obvious hypocrisy. And then saying in his backup position, we would employ her if she took off her hijab. And come on. So the bill will, I think, through reasonable discussion and dialogue, and I'm so pleased you're going to court. I hope you succeed. But the reality, and I don't like the use of the notwithstanding clause. I object to that very firmly as a lawyer and as a civil libertarian. I think it's a terrible idea. But going into an election campaign in this election where it's we stand for human rights, no question. We recognize that within Quebec society, there's also always the risk of division and the notion of Quebecers feeling disrespected. So I want to try to navigate this and say, look, if I was Prime Minister, I would meet with Prime Minister Legault immediately and try to discuss how he can get the respect for the notion of a secular public service that does not do what Bill 21 does, which is clearly to discriminate against people of various religions where wearing the religious symbol is an aspect of identity and can't be removed without violating their liberties and violating the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So finding a way to respect the Assemblée Nationale without accepting that this is at all acceptable to Canadian society or to Quebec society and working our way through it is where we land. But we're absolutely opposed to Bill 21. And that's our policy. Pierre Nantel is opposed to Bill 21. Daniel Green's opposed to Bill 21. Greens across Quebec are opposed to it, but they'd rather spend the election campaign, frankly, talking about the climate emergency. That's the focus of our platform, that's the focus of our work, but it doesn't mean that we don't defend human rights.
I mean, you just have to understand that
Yeah.
for you're the leader of the Green Party, you can change policy. If there's
No, not
you can't change policy in your own party.
No, not the leader of the Green Party. I don't have any powers.
You don't have any powers to even say to your own candidates, you know what, you can't take the position. Or I strongly advise you not to take the position. I can strongly advise, and can you say that? I strongly advise you not to take the position that a Jewish man wearing a kippah can't become a lawyer.
Well, that's a violation of our values to have a position like that. The 6 core Green values are fundamental to every Green Party around the world.
What I'm saying is that's what Bill 21 says.
I know.
It says that someone with a kippah.
But what you put to me was, number one, this thing about telling people what they can or can't say in the election isn't something that ever came from me or the party as far as I know. I don't know what that came from. My role, just because I think it's important, we're so different from the other parties. My role, the Elections Act says that every candidate must have nomination papers signed by the leader. That's what created the power that leaders have to browbeat their members and make them accept whipped votes, vote against their party policies, whatever is required at the leader's whim. Green Party took the step of restricting what the leader does. So if I were to say, I don't like the cut of the jib of that guy, I'm not signing his or her nomination papers, which is the power I have under the Elections Act. I don't have that power in the Green Party, because we have a bylaw that says if you're not going to sign the nomination papers for a candidate, you need a supermajority vote within the federal council. So just to clarify, we have core Green values. If someone isn't describing their values, they can't run. But I can't dictate what they say. I don't have that power. And I can't tell them how to vote in Parliament. I don't have that power. And I think that's appropriate because we're a party that believes in grassroots democracy. But I can tell you that all around the world, Greens stand firmly, as we do in Canada, for human rights, for civil liberties, for individual rights. But I don't have power as a leader to do what you asked, which is why I have to explain that.
Well, I will leave it at that and we'll open it up.
Okay.
I wanted to say thank you so much for engaging us with us in a discussion. We're going to open it up now, and I'll hand it back to Janelle. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that lively discussion, and we're just getting started. Actually, I'll take
So
over
Janelle, jump
in
in.
just a second, yeah. So we are going to open up to the representatives from the community members. So you still have a little bit of time for your town hall questions, and I see folks have their hands up because they're trying to get them in, but there's still a little bit of time for that. We're gonna hear first from the Canadian Muslim Vote, a national nonprofit, nonpartisan grassroots organization that aims to increase civic engagement of Canadian Muslims through community outreach and education. I'm gonna ask them to ask their question. The microphone is just at the side there, and Ms. May, you'll have 5 minutes to answer each question. I'll keep the time. And
Janelle, we're probably running out of time. Would you like me to give shorter answers?
it's up to you.
Okay.
You have up to 5 minutes.
Okay.
We didn't use them all in the last town hall, so
Okay.
here we have some opportunity to make up ground here. So I'll let you ask your question, and I'll get myself set up over here.
Hello? Okay, perfect. Hello, Mrs. May. My name is Fars. We spoke a little bit earlier. And my question is on behalf of the Canadian Muslim Vote, a proud community partner of the Leader Town Hall series. Thank you for being here. Over 60% of Canadian Muslims who responded to the Canadian Muslim Vote Federal Issues survey this year selected immigration as a key election issue. Immigration has always been a contentious election issue. Please articulate what you feel is an ideal immigration system in Canada that balances both economic needs and humanitarian commitments. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Faiz. We want to encourage more immigration in Canada. We want to get rid of the notion of temporary foreign worker program. If you're good enough to work in Canada, you're good enough to move here, bring your family, and stay here. So we need to approach with a large degree of economic reality. We don't have enough workers. We bound with compassion and inclusiveness and knowing that our society is stronger when we're more diverse. And so we also have areas of Canada that are experiencing profound economic stress due to depopulation. We need to figure out, in an ideal program, increasing immigration and increasing our welcoming of refugees. And we need to plan ahead, frankly, because if our program is fully executed to go off fossil fuels in time to avoid catastrophic levels of climate change, that will mean that we succeed in holding climate refugees to only millions of people a year instead of tens of millions of people a year. So we are going to have to be prepared to accept many more refugees, and we need to plan for that with infrastructure in places where we currently don't have infrastructure. And we need, as much as possible, to encourage that the settlement of additional and an increased number of immigrants be directed as much as possible to areas where there is a profound need for more people to move in, for more children at the desks in the schools, for more economic activity at the grassroots level from people moving in and joining communities. That means more help with English as a second language, more support, particularly for women. A lot of new Canadian families, the women are often very isolated, have trouble finding childcare, have trouble getting into the job market, have trouble with language skills. Their husbands are more likely to be able to make success of it earlier. So there's a lot of preparedness for expanding immigration and into those areas of Canada where people are most desperate and where housing is cheaper, where jobs are more available, in areas like northern Quebec, Saskatchewan, lots of parts of the Maritimes, Newfoundland and Labrador. We need immigration in those particular areas, and we need to figure out how to, without restricting the mobility rights of new Canadians, to make these places welcoming and vibrant with the supports that people coming to Canada from non-English speaking countries and non-French speaking countries to get themselves established. One of my favorite stories, of course, out of the recent welcoming of Syrian refugees is the family that settled in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. A Syrian family in Antigonish, Nova Scotia is not going to find a lot of compatriots there, but they're now they founded a company which you probably all heard of, Peace by Chocolate, and they are asking for a significant expansion of Syrian refugees to Antigonish so that they can expand. They were chocolatiers before, they were chocolatiers in Damascus. And they want at least a dozen more Syrian families to move into Antigonish so they can expand their chocolate. This is just one little glimmer of the way we think immigration should go.
Thank you for that. This Brittany mic wasn't made for a hijab wearing person.
It wasn't made for any human being that I know of, but apparently Madonna likes them.
Can you hear if I hold it this way? Okay, yeah, because it's
Yeah, it's tricky.
it's not omnidirectional, so I've just got to find the point. There it is.
Yeah.
I think that's it. How's that? Is that okay? Okay, there we go. Okay, our next question comes from the Black Muslim Initiative, a grassroots advocacy and social support organization dedicated to understanding and addressing issues at the intersection of the Black and Muslim experience. And they've asked me to ask the question on their behalf. So I'm just reading off my phone here. The question is, one area that's often ignored by leaders is youth justice reform. Too many Black youth are a part of the justice system, and we know less of the number of Black Muslim youth incarcerated. What will your youth justice reform policy do to ensure that more Black Muslim youth are not caught up in the criminal justice system?
Yeah. There are a lot of marginalized groups where the sentence can be filled in. There's a disproportionate representation of Group X in our prisons. Indigenous youth, Indigenous women, Muslim youth, Black youth. So I sometimes turn it around and think, why do we not ever say there's a disproportionate absence of white-collar criminals in our prisons? But never mind. To redress this, we need a sweeping criminal justice reforms. We need to eliminate all the mandatory minimum sentence laws. I actually put together a full list of all the mandatory minimums and put forward a private member's bill in the last session of Parliament to remove them all in one fell swoop by finding them, listing them, and removing them. Unfortunately, it didn't get through. I will keep trying, but if I were in a position to form government or influence government, we need to get rid of mandatory minimums. We also need to ensure, and I think guaranteed livable income will help. We need to ensure that people are in a position to survive and live and feel accepted and welcomed in society. Reasonable programs in, we have a youth corps in our platform so that young people can get job experience early, working in a youth corps where they're directed by municipal order of government to do important projects within communities, so there's immediate outlet for work. I think gang crime remains a problem, and particular groups are more at risk of being pulled into gangs. But being pulled into gangs generally comes from a place where there's a sense of hopelessness at an intergenerational level about poverty as a state of being. And so my stepson is actually a prosecuting lawyer with the province of BC, specifically dealing with gang crime. There are a lot of things about gang crime that we need to eradicate, and one of the things we need to do is give our prosecutors better tools. They don't have the same access that they do in other countries, in the US, for instance, to forensic accounting. If you're trying to figure out who's a kingpin in some kind of gang activity, it's often easier to catch them by figuring out the way they fiddle their income tax than catching them in the act. I mean, actually, Al Capone was caught on income tax fraud and not for the people he killed. So we need to, gang crime represents a very specific kind of threat to public safety, but it also represents a threat to young people because if they're pulled into it young, it's hard for them to get out, and then they become part of a criminal justice cycle where they expect to go back into jail. We need to break that. We need many more programs in restorative justice. We need to recognize that keeping someone in jail costs about $100,000 a year. Making sure they get an education and a roof over their head is much cheaper. But there's a tremendous amount of injustice bred into our criminal justice system right now. A lot of damage was done in the Harper years where it became, I'd say, somewhat fashionable or at least politically expedient in that era to talk about the victims of crime and demonize people who were in jail. We also, by the way, need to do more for victims of crime. We haven't even brought in the basic levels of awareness for someone who is a victim of crime, that they have rights to participate in this way and that way, and they need supports and they need mental health support sometimes just to cope with having been a victim of a crime. But violence against women, I'm going to get into that, but that's a different answer.
I think there is a question on that coming up, and we still have a minute on this question, so I want to ask a follow-up.
No,
Can I ask,
sure.
What's your stance on carding? That is something that we're talking
We're
specifically
against
about.
it, period,
Black
full
youth.
stop. I mean, there is such an obvious bias in who gets stopped in carding. Obvious bias. And that needs to be removed. And another thing, of course, that will help is diversifying our police forces, diversifying the RCMP. They've done some work toward this, but we need to make sure that our police forces look like our public, so that people don't feel that that the RCMP or the police are just there to harass them constantly. That's not a good or healthy society.
That segues right into our next question, which comes from the University of Toronto's Muslim Student Association, a campus group formed to serve and represent the needs of Muslim students on and off campus. I'm also reading a question on their behalf. The MSA is asking, as a federal candidate running for the premiership of this country, what do you specifically plan to do about the surveillance of Muslims by Canadian national security organizations such as RCMP and CSIS? This is something that was reported in one of my colleagues, I won't mention the name of the competitor, but this was a story that came out about U of T students and university students being questioned, targeted by CSIS, so much so that they had to create a hotline to assist these young students. So I'll let you respond.
Well, I'm very concerned about the nature of anti-terrorism legislation in Canada. I was the first member of Parliament to denounce Bill C-51 under Stephen Harper. I remember it was tabled for first reading on a Friday, and I think the following Monday was the first Monday in February, and I showed up in Parliament and denounced it as a police state bill. C-59, which just became law, does quite a lot to redress some of the worst elements of C-51, but leaves in place the idea that CSIS has kinetic powers to be able to interrupt plots and so on. This is a big mistake. CSIS was created to be an intelligence gathering operation and should not have the powers to also be engaged in entrapment, creating undercover operators whose job is to quote-unquote disrupt plots. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to get CSIS back in its role of intelligence gathering. They clearly, as I mentioned earlier in response to the questions with Mustafa, underestimate, I think, the threat of white supremacists. And I'm also from a community that keeps being harassed and targeted, which is environmental groups and indigenous groups blocking pipelines. And I warn everybody, if you're involved in any activity of nonviolent civil disobedience, and anyone within your group, someone shows up at a meeting and suggests inciting violence, at that moment it would be a very good reason to say, would you please leave, I think you're a cop. Entrapment and infiltration is the bread and butter of the so-called anti-terrorism police within this country. And people involved in any social movement need to be very watchful and wary. In terms of the harassment of young Muslim students, it's outrageous and unacceptable that our state police think that this is a particular group for their attention. They need to move to where the real issues are. They should pay attention to our borders and gun smuggling. And by the way, the Canadian Border Security Agency, CBSA, has no oversight body whatsoever. They're a law unto themselves, and they go out and find people who are law-abiding and contributing to the society. But if their permanent residency papers are not in order, or their citizenship papers are not in order, CBSA has been, particularly in the Harper years, but they haven't stopped, grabbing people and getting them deported within as little as 24 hours. Not due process, it's not appropriate, so we need to get a handle on CBSA and direct them to pay attention to, at the border, stopping drugs and handguns and semi-automatic weapons. They need to pay attention to getting guns out of our cities and not to trying to figure out if young Muslim students are somehow subversive.
I actually did a story on CBSA not having an oversight body. Do you believe that one needs to be formed, an arm's length. When you complain to CBSA, you're complaining, or when you're complaining about CBSA, you're complaining to CBSA.
Yes, exactly. No, I mean, there are a lot of really good agents in all of these organizations, for sure. But I've done a lot of work as a member of parliament and as a former immigration and refugee advocate. I've done a lot of work trying to stop deportations. I've been successful a couple of times. The times I've failed are heartbreaking. The CBSA is right now doing things that violate the essence of who we are as a people in Canada. And one key change that happened under Harper, you probably came onto this in your story, but they changed the rule around deportation from deporting people as soon as is practicable. Under Harper, it changed to as soon as is possible. And the difference was practicable meant if you're going to be deporting this person who quite often might have been born outside of Canada but lived their whole life here, they're going to a country they don't know anyone and they don't speak the language, CBSA no longer has to figure out if they have a place to go. They can just ship them out fast. And there is a basement holding area under the Vancouver airport where people who are sent there generally don't get out at all. They're just deported to whatever their country of origin was, regardless of how much they're unlikely to succeed, how little chance they'll have of finding anyone they know. This is not our country. This is not how we see ourselves. So a lot of attention should be paid to how we're, or people who are held under, they're awaiting terrorism charges. They can be held forever and held in, without ever having charges laid, with no rights, no habeas corpus, for years. We have to change those laws, and that's part of our platform, to ensure that anyone who's being held on the notion that there might be a terrorism charge someday, either charge them or let them out. Don't hold people violating their rights in jails, in some cases in solitary confinement. And our most recent laws, not to rant too much about this, but the solitary confinement law still allows solitary confinement. I put forward a lot of amendments. I put forward amendments, by the way, in Parliament on almost every bill, and I go to almost every committee with my amendments. I really hope to have more than 12 MPs after this election, because the job right now is killing me. It's taking years off my life because Harper changed the rules so that as a single member of Parliament, as the only Green Party member, I was causing them too much grief. I was more effective at fighting Harper than all the other opposition parties. So they got annoyed and they said, look, what we'll have to do is say that she's not allowed to bring forward amendments at report stage anymore, but we'll have the opportunity at every committee, which means some days I have amendments to one committee in clause by clause, and then I'm literally in two places at once. I have to go back and forth between committees. Boy, do I need more MPs, but that's another problem.
All right, we'll move on to the last community partner question before we get to the town hall questions. So a good opportunity, if you haven't already submitted your question through cue cards and online, now's a good chance to do so. Okay, the last question is from CCMW, which is, sorry, I'm supposed to read it from here. The Canadian Council of Muslim Women. They're asking, gender Islamophobia is proving devastating for Canadian Muslim women. If you form government, how will you address this pressing issue?
Well, there are a lot of gender-based issues that extend beyond the Islamic community, although it's a very critical one. Certainly the changes that have been happening, I've talked to young Islamic women who've grown up here their whole lives and only recently have started feeling as if they're not welcome. And we have to be very, very clear that taunts or abuse of any kind is unacceptable. This goes back to I think a lot of cleaning out social media. We have to make sure that people know their rights and are supported. The institutions, whether it's their employment or at universities, need to be more supportive and prepared to recognize this is a particularly vulnerable group right now and requires more supports.
Okay, we're moving quickly because we are trying to get to the actual town hall questions, and we know we're quite behind on time. So, this question comes from someone who submitted a cue card. U.S. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have inspired Canadian Muslims for the principal's human rights position on BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. You threatened to quit your party over BDS. Why disparage this human rights movement? That's my question. Yeah.
I didn't threaten to quit my party over BDS. I threatened that I didn't threaten. I wasn't sure I could stay if we didn't go back to our decision-making method that has always worked, that is embedded in our Constitution, which is consensus-based decision-making. So we had made a number of decisions for the first time ever on an experiment in one meeting of our convention of all of our members. There were a couple of issues that went through very fast on Robert's Rules of Order, and there was no consensus. We returned to the issue within months using our consensus-based process, and we achieved a consensus that includes saying, and I want to be very clear about this, I'm absolutely a supporter of Palestinian rights. I absolutely condemn what the government of Mr. Netanyahu has done. The expansion of settlements is basically appropriation of land in Palestinian territory for the purpose of undermining the two-state solution. You can't get a two-state solution if the land for a Palestinian state has been gobbled up. And when I helped reform a group that used to exist but hadn't been in Parliament for years, which is the Canada-Palestinian Parliamentary Friendship Group. And I worked to we had an invitation from the Palestinian Authority. 18 of us as members of Parliament toured areas of occupied territory and saw for ourselves how children are treated by the Israeli military and so on. I won't go on and on about it, just to say I support the right of the State of Israel to exist. I support a two-state solution. And I believe, and we asked every Palestinian organization we met on that tour how they felt about BDS, and they opposed it because it strengthens Mr. Netanyahu's hands in increasing the people within Israel to feel that they are under attack. So the term boycott Israel is not smart if we want to protect Palestinian rights. The use of the tools can be smart. So for instance, we call for identification of products. We want to reform the Canada-Israel trade agreement so that labeling of products cannot be labeled product of Israel if they're outside the legal boundaries pre-1967 of Israel. Should not be able, Canadian consumers or consumers in the EU as well, they've done this in the EU, we should do it in Canada, to know what's from legal Israel and what's from disputed territory. We also need to be able to say we will sanction. We also need to be able to talk about changed arrangements and more pressure. The things under Stephen Harper, I'll never forget, we had a Canadian corporal from, I should remember his name, a Dutch name, from the part of a UN presence in a sentry post observing the shelling of Lebanon. And it was very clear the Israeli military targeted a UN watch facility, and nationals from 7 countries were killed, and only Canada didn't even protest. Yeah, so we have a very big challenge as a country to take a stronger stand with Israel as an ally. We know that we have a significant amount of I should say sort of almost a voluntary censorship within our parliament about discussing Israel. I voted against any motion to in any way sanction or criminalize people using BDS as a strategy. Everyone has a right to pursue it, but from my point of view, it's counterproductive. As I've studied it, I don't believe that calling for BDS, because the ultimate ends of the BDS movement include basically don't protect the right of the State of Israel to exist. So it creates more, and this was true for everybody we talked to when we went through Ramallah, Hebron, Bethlehem, talking to what's left of any kind of peace movement within the Israeli parliament, within the Knesset. There's a very strong sense that the more the world community proclaims boycott Israel, the more politically within Israel Netanyahu's hand is strengthened.
Just really quickly, do you agree with the Prime Minister's stance about BDS on university campuses? We are on a university campus.
No, free speech is free speech is free speech. No.
Thank you for clarifying your stance on that. We'll move to another question also from the Q card of the audience. You spoke about controlling social media. However, the role of traditional media, particularly radio shows, especially in Quebec, have a great deal of responsibility in creating deeply virulent anti-Muslim attitudes in Quebec. How would you address those parts of the media? We have them here in Toronto too, radio talk shows that aren't maybe regulated the same way as have the same journalistic standards. I'll let you address that question.
That's a really interesting question. The questions of free speech and the boundaries are important, but it's important to also have journalistic standards within the CRTC. Fair and balanced reporting is a requirement, and that will require greater regulation through the CRTC. One of the great lessons learned about the importance of a fair, free, and accurate news media is direct relationship to the health of democracy. The key thing that I think ended up with Trump in the White House took place under Reagan when the US Federal Communications Commission deregulated and removed the requirement that news coverage had to be fair and balanced. That's what brought in Fox News. It was a deliberate plan. I'm not a conspiracy theorist particularly, but this is just too obvious to miss. There was lots of funding for the right wing. There was a lot of effort to bring in Fox News to move public opinion in the US to the right. And tragically, it appears to have worked. We must not allow that to happen in Canada. News coverage has to be fair and balanced. And talk show hosts who run off at the mouth and promote hate speech need to be regulated through the CRTC. So you have to find that balance between free speech, which, as I said, free speech is free speech, but hate speech is not acceptable if you're going to have a healthy democracy.
Okay, we're going to take the last question also from the audience, or I believe so, I'm not sure where it's coming from. How will you hold corruptions accountable that burn a lot of fossil fuels and hurt the environment, for example, the tar sands?
We'll shut them down. This is essential if we're going to survive. So the transition is really, we don't have time for transition anymore. We know from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report of October 8th, 2018, that humanity has only one chance to ensure that the planetary conditions remain habitable for our species. And certainly, we have only one chance to ensure that we retain the climate that's sufficiently stable that human civilization will survive. That requirement is to hold global average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. That's not a political target. It's in the Paris Agreement, but it's derived from science. The opportunity to hold to that level of climate crisis disruption, to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius, requires globally cutting fossil fuel use in half, plus many other Herculean efforts in replanting forests and changing land use and changing agriculture by 2030. And you can't cut greenhouse gases in half globally. And by the way, in Canada, when you crunch the numbers, for us to do our fair share, because we're so far behind most industrialized countries, we will have to cut by 60% below 2005 levels by 2030 and to net zero by 2050. Now, this is not about politics. This is, as Bill McKibben says, usually and Bill McKibben, who founded 350.org and is a prolific and brilliant author. Anyway, Bill McKibben said recently, was an event with me, he's usually in political issues. You'll have a group over here and a group over here, and the goal of politics is to arrive in the middle somewhere. But you can't negotiate with physics. We only have one chance to ensure that civilization remains in place and the planet remains habitable. That chance will expire for us well before 2030, because the effort required to reduce emissions sufficiently that we hold to 1.5 and achieve that by 2030 requires actions taken and a directional change of course within the next 18 months. We don't have years, we have months. So given the severity of the threat, we have to try a couple of things that are different. We're calling, and I'm calling for trying to take the partisanship out of the issue by having the equivalent of what occurred in the Second World War with an inner cabinet that's focused on survival. In the Second World War, under Mackenzie King and Winston Churchill, they were called a war cabinet, an inner cabinet. We call it an inner survival cabinet to make sure this works. Because we can't run the risk of bringing in a good climate plan in one government to have the subsequent government cancel it. We need to make sure everybody is engaged in the project and we stay the course. Once Canada has a good climate strategy and a real plan, we can then do more globally to encourage other countries to join. But as I said, right now we're quite far behind most countries, but we need to catch up because globally, if every country on Earth keeps its current targets and achieves them, we blow right by 1.5, we blow right by 2, and we're in the area of 3-degree warming, which is where chances of human civilization surviving are approximately nil. So given that, the strategy to go off fossil fuels starts with setting the target that that's what we're going to do, and in stages, a robust electricity grid, a Canadian grid strategy is required so that we can get renewable energy from one province to the other easily. We don't have that now. We also need to ensure that the electricity grid is decarbonized. There is no fossil fuel source of electricity in Canada. We can drive down the demand for oil and gas very quickly by banning the internal combustion engine by 2030 and moving to a strategy of either fuel cells and hydrogen. We don't rule that out, but right now it looks like the market winner is going to be electric vehicles, plus changing our transit system so there is public access to affordable public transit, not just in our urban areas, but in rural and remote areas where people are, and by the way, if you're reading the inquiry in missing and murdered Indigenous women, a key factor there was both the construction camps, which they've referred to in the report as the man camps for remote building of pipelines and so on, but also the absence of any bus, much less affordable buses. So there's a lot that combines equity and climate in the same effort, but it has to be clear that the goal is to eliminate fossil fuel use globally approximately in half by 2030 and to almost to net zero by 2050. And those aren't negotiable. Those are about following the advice of science while we still have time.
I've been given permission to squeeze in one last question. I know we're really over time here, but I think we would be remiss not to talk about what's been in the news this week. And we had our town hall earlier this week with the NDP leader. Of course, we've heard what's happened in New Brunswick with a number of NDP party members coming over to the Greens. And Jagmeet Singh was with us on stage, and he said more than once, I think in various media outlets as well, that the Green Party has a lot to answer for accepting these candidates, knowing that part of the reason that some have been concerned about is the electorate not willing to vote in a party with a leader who has a turban. So I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
In every single syllable of what you just repeated to me, Jagmeet Singh was speaking without any evidence. Be very clear on that. I have been...
The candidate said it on the CBC in an interview.
Excuse me. The candidate did not ever say that they were leaving the NDP because they could not support Mr. Singh. They never said that. So if I can just be very clear, Jagmeet Singh has received nothing but support and collaborative effort from the Greens. He might not have ever been elected in Burnaby if we hadn't decided voluntarily not to run a candidate against him. No other party did that. And in the entire history of the New Democratic Party, they have never observed this parliamentary tradition called the Leader's Courtesy Agreement to ensure that the leader of a party who doesn't have a seat gets a seat in Parliament through something called Leader's Courtesy. So we didn't just walk the talk. We actually did not run a candidate against Mr. Singh so that he would get his seat in Parliament. We have been supportive. No other party, the NDP has never done that for anyone. I called Jagmeet first and made sure, I said, would you accept this if we offer it? And he said that would be really, he went and talked to his team. So I've tried to develop, as I do with every other person across party lines, a collaborative, friendly relationship. Now, in the case of the New Brunswick New Democrats, they organized themselves. I never made a statement. Jagmeet has said, I have a lot of explaining to do. I'm happy to explain, because what he said is ridiculous. The NDP members in New Brunswick left their party because they had tried without success to get their leader to come visit them. He's been leader for 2 years and never set foot in New Brunswick. That's the reason that they left. I didn't talk to them. I didn't recruit them. I don't know them. I've never spoken to them. They organized themselves. They wrote a statement, and they announced in New Brunswick that they were going to join the Green Party, not as candidates, as members. And that's what they wanted to do. Now, the reality of it is that after they made that announcement, some said, no, not us. We didn't ever agree to that. One of the people who said, we never knew anyone was going to announce that we were going to join the Green Party, it's not true, actually had the day before joined the Green Party and sent us a donation. We have now contacted them and said, you can't be a member of 2 parties at once, so here you go. I find the whole thing baffling that anyone thinks this is an issue.
So I want to push back because Jonathan Richardson, I believe is his name, was quoted in Canadian press as saying that he did believe that racism played a factor and that some members, he didn't say who, were concerned that the electorate would vote this way.
What he said was, and I don't,
Sorry.
may I say,
Yes.
I didn't know him, I don't know him.
Yes.
He was a key person in the NDP at the federal level, and he had been for years, and the people who left the NDP to join the Greens included people who had been running as NDP candidates in the fall 2018 election in New Brunswick. They obviously supported their leader. They were running. They wished their leader had supported them and done what I did in that provincial election, was to show up and go door to door for Green Party candidates. So Greens in New Brunswick elected 3 MLAs. The NDP elected no one. Would it have been different if he had gone? Probably, because when your leader shows up, it helps you. So,
are you saying what he's saying is not true?
no,
or that
I'm just
it
going to
is
explain the
incorrect?
context. From what I understand, I wasn't at the press conference, but I've asked a lot of questions about it, as you can imagine, because I wouldn't want anyone in the Green Party who was a racist. We wouldn't allow it. We do actually screen even members. We have rejected people from membership, not just candidacy, but membership. If we find evidence on their Facebook pages or whatever of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, we don't want them. In this case, after they announced that they had felt ignored and abandoned by their federal party leader, because in 2 years, he didn't get there once. In that same period, I got there 3 times, and I was working full-time in Parliament. Mr. Singh didn't get his seat till earlier this year, so I find it baffling. It's the job of a federal party leader to show up. I'm sorry, but you really do have to show up. Someone in the media in the question session asked Jonathan Richardson if he had experienced racism, if he thought it was a factor. And he just quite honestly said, well, I have, doing door-to-door, on the doorstep, sometimes I find people who aren't prepared. Now that is, obviously I condemn any attitudes of that kind, as I believe Mr. Richardson would as well. I mean, let's face it, he's going door-to-door to support people voting NDP, and I think the NDP should be very proud of having the first visible minority leader. I think it's terrific for our democracy. That's why we took the step of trying to help him get elected. You understand me? I'm telling you that as leader of the Green Party, I took it to my federal council. I don't want to run a candidate against Jagmeet Singh. It's going to be a close race. If we run, he might not get his seat. He should be in Parliament. That's been my position from the beginning. He announced when he first was elected leader of the NDP that he didn't intend to try to get a seat until the general election so that he could go across the country and organize for the NDP. And at the time I said, you know, really, you belong in Parliament. You should get to Parliament. Run in a by-election. So we assisted. Positive, helpful assistance doesn't happen all that often across party lines in Canada. In the case of what the media pushed Mr. Richardson to say, he acknowledged something horrific, that on the doorstep, he'd experienced racism. But I would not fight for there's nothing in any of the transcripts of anything I've checked from that press conference that suggests that was a motivation for him leading the New Democrats. Far from it. He left the Democratic Party because he couldn't get his leader to show up and express concern for New Brunswick issues. I was particularly shocked because I fully expected to see Jagmeet Singh in New Brunswick, in Fredericton, on July 24th this year, because that was the annual general meeting of the Assembly of First Nations, and all leaders were invited. I, to this day, have no idea what Jagmeet Singh was doing that day that was more important than showing up for the Assembly of First Nations AGM. And it would have been, if I'd been on his staff, I would have said, this is the perfect opportunity. You haven't gotten to New Brunswick yet. Go to the AFN AGM, meet your ground volunteers. Had he done that, I doubt very much that these people would have wanted to join the Green Party.
All right, we're gonna have to leave it there. Elizabeth May, thank you so much for taking the time. Yes, please give her a round of applause. Asked a lot of questions. We've gone well past our time. Asked some difficult questions and heard some clarification on your stances. Learned a little bit more about the Green Party, which I hope really that was the point of this evening. And so that brings us to the end of our question and answer period. We do have one or two final closing remarks. I know it's getting late on a Friday evening, so I am going to invite Ali Manik from the Canadian Muslim Vote up to the stage to say a few words. You can clap for him as he makes his story. Yeah, it's
that's fine. Assalamu alaikum, and hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And Ms. May, thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure having you here today. The Canadian Muslim Vote, we are a non-profit, non-partisan organization that is encouraging people to go and vote. Not just the Muslim community, but all Canadians. And what we're trying to do very, very hard is to break down any barriers to democracy that exist in society for our community and for every community. And this year is one of the most important elections in the history of Canada, and specifically in the history of Canadian Muslims in this country. And so for those of you who are in the crowd today, my message to you is very, very clear. I don't care who you vote for. You know what, when you walked in, you said something beautiful. You said, we should be voting for what we want. And I didn't want to say it to you then, but I'll say it now. I don't care what you want. We just want you to be there. Because being there is how we get a seat at the table. Being there on election day and casting your ballot, regardless of who it is that you want to vote for, is the first step in us progressing as a community and as a society. And I've said this so many times that while we keep talking about wanting a seat at the table, it's not for the sake of having a seat at the table. It's because when we as community members, as minorities, as whoever it is that we're representing, when we have a seat at the table, we make the table stronger. We make democracy stronger. And on October 21st, that is what we're going to do, because we're all going to go and vote. Let me hear it for everyone in the room who's going to go and vote. October 21st, we will make democracy stronger, we will make the table stronger, and that is what our message is. Please come and visit us. We will make democracy easy for you and voting easy for you. Sign up for our mailing list. You do not have to belong to the Muslim community to receive all of the resources that will make voting easy for you on election day. Thank you so much. I know it's late. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you for being here, and it's an absolute pleasure to be partnering with NCCM on these wonderful series of events that were taking place. Come up to the next ones. I believe the next one's on the 13th. Make sure that you guys are there for that one as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'm going to be very quick in wrapping this up. I always ask not to ever have to speak after Ellie, because the Canadian Muslim Vote is lucky to have a tall, handsome executive director who kind of looks like Superman. Thank you so much. Make sure you get out and vote. We wanted to, also make sure that we give a special thanks to Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party of Canada. We appreciate so much you coming out to talk to us, for us to learn, for us to listen, for us to engage. Because at the end of the day, that's what democracy is about. It's about talking to each other.
Can I just add one thing, Mustafa? I want you to know that I thought this event was so important that I left British Columbia this morning and I go back tomorrow morning. I came to Toronto for this. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It means so much. It means so much. And as well, I'd like to give a big round of applause for our MC, Janelle Massa. She's incredible. Big round of applause for her. I'd also like to quickly just put on the record, these events aren't free. So as you're leaving, please do consider, giving like $5-6 us, keep putting on events where we're chatting to folks, talking about democracy, learning about the issues. We do have an upcoming event with the Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Lisa Raitt, which will be on the 13th in Milton at the Lions Club. So I encourage you all to come out to that. Again, thanks all for your patience and